So the Oppo Find X5 Pro. It's what you get if you take last year's phone, the Find X3 Pro, iron out a lot of the annoyances, give the camera a boost in low light and video recording, and make the charging even more ridiculously fast. So in some ways it's a kind of predictable and slightly conservative upgrade this year for the Oppo flagship, but it's also a much better rounded device than we saw from Oppo in 2021 with fewer, if any, compromises. So let's dive in and take a closer look in our full review of the Oppo Find X5 Pro. Take a sec to subscribe so you don't miss more reviews like this one, and we'll get started. The first thing you'll notice about the Find X5 Pro is the absolutely stunning rear design, which hasn't changed much since last year's Oppo flagship, but honestly didn't need to. This back panel, molded from a single piece of ceramic, still stands out in the sea of relatively plain-looking smartphone derrieres. Still, no one else is making a phone with a camera bulge quite like this, curving the ceramic itself into a raised surface where the lenses are housed. One benefit of ceramic is it's supposed to be more scratch-resistant than the Gorilla Glass used in the back of most smartphones, and although I haven't picked up any scuffs just yet, I am still only a couple of weeks into using it. My only beef with the way this phone looks is the almost comical number of logos, regulatory labels, and other guff cluttering up the side of this thing. Seriously, there's no reason for all this stuff to be here. Other phones can either show this stuff in the software or display it much more discreetly. The new addition to that logo pile this year is Hasselblad. After partnering with OnePlus in 2021, the Swedish camera brand now brings its talents to the parent brand Oppo. We'll get into exactly what that means later in the review, but for now let's just say that cooperation is still in its quite early stages. Around the front there's nothing too crazy going on. This curved AMOLED panel looks fantastic and is brighter than ever with a peak 1300 nits of brightness, but the design on the front is pretty run-of-the-mill with a hole-punch selfie camera and a slight chin area down below. Likewise, on the inside there's a predictable spec sheet with all the high-end hardware you'd expect to see, the latest Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 processor, 12 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage in the model I've been using. That 12 gigs of RAM should be enough for pretty much anything you're doing on a phone in 2022, but if you do want to pad it out a little, Oppo has its new RAM expansion feature. Kinda like virtual memory on a PC, it uses your free internal storage to act like extended RAM, up to 7 gigs on top of the 12 that's already there. I can't say I've really noticed any difference in multitasking performance either way, but this is probably a feature that'll be much more useful in lower end devices that have less real memory to begin with. Also new this time around is eSIM support, which is a first for Oppo in addition to the dual SIM functionality that's pretty common in Android phones outside the US. Oppo's also upgraded its battery to a new 5000 mAh cell in the Find X5 Pro, and when pushing the phone hard, I've been getting a pretty reasonable full day of use out of it, with around 16 hours off the charger and 5 to 6 hours of screen on time if I'm not using any of the phone's battery saver modes. That's an okay level of battery performance, but far from mind-blowing, and the camera in particular seemed especially battery hungry to me, particularly compared to the Google Pixel 6 Pro I just moved out of. The Oppo Find series has rarely blown us away with its battery life though, instead it's more been about super fast charging. And this year Oppo returns with 50-watt wireless charging, assuming you've got an Oppo or OnePlus wireless charging pad, along with SuperVOOC wired charging at a whopping 80 watts. The 80-watt charging brick provided in the box refills the phone at a ludicrously quick rate. I plugged in the Find X5 Pro with 1% remaining, came back 10 minutes later and it was already back to 43%, which is almost half a day's worth of power. In total, a refill from almost dead to full took 40 minutes, with the charging timeline looking like this. So as you'd expect, it's quicker earlier on, with charging rates leveling off significantly around the 80% mark. Still, going from the precipice of battery oblivion to the relative safety of a 70% charge in the time it takes to take a quick shower and change your clothes is seriously impressive. Probably the biggest reason to care about this phone though is the cameras. On the surface, in terms of the basic hardware, not a whole lot has really changed since the Find X3 Pro. Both the main and ultra-wide cameras still use Sony's 50-megapixel IMX766 sensor, which, while perfectly fine, is a step behind the very best sensors used in Apple and Samsung's flagships. There's also a 2x telephoto at 13 megapixels, nothing to write home about there in terms of the numbers, and Oppo's also lost the gimmicky microscope camera from the previous model for whatever that's worth. The secret sauce for this camera though is Oppo's new Marisilicon X NPU. a new neural processing unit that's supposed to handle all that pixel crunching and help the phone produce clearer video and better low-light images. And with one or two caveats, that's pretty much exactly what it does. I've been impressed with the Find X5 Pro's photography across the board, especially in portrait mode and in very low light scenes. Shots still have the typical saturated pop that you might recognize from earlier Oppo phones. Though it does seem to have been tamed somewhat in this latest model, daylight pictures aren't as excessively saturated as the equivalent shots from a Find X3. Same also applies to selfies from the 32 megapixel front facer. Colors look more natural and the phone's able to avoid even brightly lit backgrounds appearing blown out. The use of a high-end sensor in both the regular and ultra-wide cameras means you get a similar level of quality even at wider angles. The main sensor still pulls ahead in darker conditions thanks to its 5-axis optical stabilization, but the ultra-wide isn't far behind. Telephoto is also not too bad, mainly being limited by its resolution and zoom level. It's good for punching in just a little to capture a touch more detail of more distant subjects, but it's no match for a periscope telephoto camera at around the 5x to 10x range. It's there, it's better than nothing, but it's definitely not a major focus for this phone. Instead, the focus is more on low light from those two main sensors. Even with a smaller sensor, the Find X5 Pro competes strongly against the Galaxy S21 Ultra, pulling in the same level of fine detail and producing clear colors even in very low light. For example, in these two shots, the green of the grass here wasn't visible to the naked eye. The Find X5 Pro manages to pull out that color detail from the grass while also keeping the brightly lit church spire in the background evenly exposed. That's the kind of challenging dynamic range that this phone really crushes, at least most of the time. There are a few situations, especially around sunset and dusk, where landscapes would be somewhat underexposed unless I really cranked up the brightness in night mode. It's this kind of situation where I really missed having a separate shadow exposure slider like Google offers in its Pixel phones. Another area where the MariSilicon X chip helps is the new 50 megapixel shooting mode. This is basically a super high detail mode for daytime shots. It's best used in still shots with good lighting, and as the name suggests, it produces photos at the full resolution of the sensor, meaning you can drill down and see a ton of detail. Video also benefits a lot from that new MariSilicon X chip. The Find X5 Pro is a great performer all round in low light video, especially considering the size of the sensors in those two main cameras. There's a good amount of fine detail retained even in very dark footage, something that's not guaranteed even with top-tier flagships like the S22 Ultra. That said, the stabilization and detail-enhancing algorithms work best without too much motion. For example, a panning shot as opposed to actually moving while holding the camera. Walking shots at night, for instance, produce a noticeable bit of judder, especially when shooting with the ultra-wide. In brighter conditions, there's a lot more wiggle room for the camera to work its magic, so I was really impressed with the dynamic range and the stabilization on offer when shooting at 4K 30 on this camera. Most of the time, Oppo's AI Scene Enhancement was able to pull out shadow detail even in very backlit shots, with the exception of shooting directly into the sun here. And for situations like that, you've also got a log video mode, which could potentially help you pull out more fine detail later using a professional video editing app. This is a Hasselblad branded camera too, which means that the Swedish camera firm has taken a look at Oppo's post-processing and is happy to put its name to it. Besides which, you've got Hasselblad's trademark orange shutter key in the camera app similar to the OnePlus 9 series, and customized haptic feedback to match the feel of a real camera, apparently. And there's also the X-Pan mode for stylized panoramic shots from the ultra-wide camera, all of which is largely forgettable to be honest. Oppo's still in the very early stages of its partnership with Hasselblad, so most of the camera tech that matters comes from the manufacturer itself. Being an Oppo phone, the Find X5 Pro of course runs ColorOS 12 based on Android 12, and if you hadn't heard this before, you might assume it's the kind of overbearing Android skin you often see on many China-focused handsets, but that's not the case here. ColorOS is actually pretty slick and pleasant to use and has been for a couple of years now. ColorOS 12.1 hasn't changed much since the previous version. The wallpaper color picker, similar to dynamic color on Pixel phones, lets you choose 4 accent colors from your wallpaper to style the rest of the UI. And Oppo continues to innovate with neat multitasking tricks, including a pretty versatile floating window mode, and quick gestures for things like split-screen multitasking. An unfortunate quirk with this version though is that although Oppo's apps and the system UI can be skinned with your own choice of accent color, this doesn't apply to anything else, including Google apps that are skinned on Pixel phones. That's a bit disappointing because Google Messages and the Google Dialer, which are the defaults on this phone, instead just take on this rather dull looking light blue color. Aside from that though, I've still really enjoyed ColorOS here. It hits a pretty nice balance of customizability, performance, and coherent design that makes for a pleasant experience all round. So that's the Oppo Find X5 Pro, a solid if slightly conservative upgrade from last year's model. And a better phone all round than the Find X3 Pro. It's a worthy competitor to the Galaxy S22 Plus, though obviously lacks a lot of the head-turning camera features of the larger Samsung flagship, the S22 Ultra. While it's disappointing that Oppo has once again shied away from including a periscope telephoto camera, the low-light capabilities of this phone are every bit as good as most rival Android flagships, excelling in extreme low-light photos and impressing in low-light video. And although Oppo's battery life at first glance is pretty run-of-the-mill, it more than compensates with ridiculously quick refills. And of course, there's that gorgeous chassis design that adds that extra bit of polish and flair to this device. So this one's definitely worth a look if you're feeling underwhelmed by the latest offerings from Samsung. Be sure to let us know what you think of the Find X5 Pro down in the comments and subscribe to Android Central so you don't miss more reviews like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.